Silver Creek was the kind of town where nothing ever seemed to change. Nestled on the edge of the Midwest, it was a place where the sun set behind the hills in a blaze of gold, casting long shadows over the small, quiet streets. Children ran through the neighborhoods, playing games, laughing, their voices carrying in the warm breeze. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass, and every house on Main Street had a white picket fence. The town's charm was built on its simplicity, and its people took pride in the peace they believed they had found. But beneath the peaceful surface, beneath the seemingly perfect small-town life, there was something much darker at play, a secret that no one spoke of but everyone knew existed in the background. It was a place where old prejudices still festered in the hearts of its people, and fear ran deeper than anyone could admit. And at the very heart of that fear stood one man, Sheriff Harold King. Harold King was Silver Creek's lawman, its rock, its protector. To most of the town, he was an icon of justice, a towering figure in a crisp uniform, his hand always steady on the reins of law and order. His reputation was built on years of service, a man who was unwavering in his dedication to maintaining peace and protecting the community. His word was law, his decisions final, and the people respected him for it. But behind that facade of righteousness was a much darker truth. Sheriff King wasn't just the man who upheld the law, he was a man who knew how to bend it to his will. His personal brand of justice had long ago twisted into something far more sinister. The black families living in Silver Creek knew this truth all too well. They were the town's outsiders, the ones whose lives didn't seem to matter as much. They were the ones whose homes were often raided on baseless accusations, whose children were taken from them without warning, and whose cries for help went unanswered. For them, the sheriff was not a protector but an oppressor, a man whose power was built on keeping them in their place. Harold King had learned early on that those who had nothing were the easiest to control, and in Silver Creek, black families were the poorest. They had nowhere to turn, no one to help them, and no resources to fight back when the law turned against them. So, over the years, Harold began to use that knowledge to his advantage. He didn't just enforce the law, he manipulated it. He created false charges against black parents, accusing them of neglect or abuse when there was no evidence. He forged reports, twisted facts, and used his influence to get them thrown into jail. Those who fought back were silenced, either through the courts or the threat of violence. And when the parents were out of the picture, it was the children who paid the price. Harold King knew that once a child was removed from their parents, they could disappear into the system. And that's exactly what happened. The children of Silver Creek's black families were taken from their homes and placed into foster care, into the hands of social services. But that was just the beginning. Behind closed doors, Harold had found a way to profit from their suffering. Through secret dealings and the dark underworld of the internet, he had created a network of wealthy buyers who sought after one thing: children. But not just any children. They wanted black children, children who had no one to defend them, who were lost to the world. Harold had sold them to the highest bidder, turning their lives into merchandise, their futures into cash. No one questioned it, no one even suspected. The missing children were just another statistic, another tragedy in a town where no one cared to look too closely, and as long as the sheriff kept his secrets hidden, nothing would ever change. Detective Caroline Wilson had always been the type of person who couldn't look the other way. She had grown up in a big city, seen all the ugliness the world had to offer. Drug cartels, human trafficking rings, corrupt officials, she'd seen it all, and she'd done whatever it took to bring those responsible to justice. But there was something about this case that felt different. Caroline had been assigned to investigate a string of disappearances in Silver Creek. The cases were baffling at first, unremarkable on their own. Children, mostly black, had gone missing over the course of several years. But there was one detail that stuck out to Caroline: every single child who had disappeared came from a black family. The parents were either incarcerated or had lost their parental rights under suspicious circumstances, and once the children were removed from their homes, they simply vanished. At first, the local police shrugged off Caroline's concerns. They told her it was just the nature of foster care, that children sometimes went missing in the system. But Caroline wasn't so easily convinced. She had seen too many cases like this before, where the system failed those who were already marginalized, and she had learned that where there was smoke, there was usually fire. Caroline's instincts told her that something far darker was at play in Silver Creek, something that no one wanted to confront. She started digging. At first, the trail was cold, just a few missing persons reports and the standard bureaucracy of social services. But as she examined the records more closely, she began to notice troubling patterns. There were too many coincidences. Too many discrepancies. She found that the parents of the missing children had been arrested on trumped-up charges. The charges were vague: abuse, neglect, but there was no evidence to support them. And when the parents were incarcerated, the children were swiftly taken away by social services, never to be seen again. As Caroline continued to dig deeper, the pieces began to fit together. The records led her to one man, Sheriff Harold King, the sheriff, who had been in charge of every arrest, every investigation, every removal of children. She had heard his name around town. His reputation was legendary, but it was more than just a name. His fingerprints were all over the disappearances. Caroline knew she had to tread carefully. Sheriff King was not a man who took kindly to outsiders poking around in his business. He was well-connected, untouchable, but Caroline had learned that justice didn't care about power or reputation. Justice only cared about truth. She needed to find the truth, and to do that, she would have to go up against the most powerful man in town. Caroline's first night in Silver Creek was spent in her hotel room, poring over the evidence she had gathered. Her desk was covered with paperwork, disjointed, incomplete case files, statements from foster parents that raised more questions than they answered, and reports that seemed far too vague for comfort. There were holes in every story, gaps in the timeline, and a rising sense that something much darker than neglect was happening in this small town, something hidden beneath the surface, a quiet conspiracy that no one dared to expose. She knew she needed more than just hunches. She needed hard evidence, and the only way to get that was to get closer to the people involved, specifically Sheriff King. The next morning, Caroline made her way to the sheriff's office. The building was imposing, stone-faced, a symbol of the power it represented in Silver Creek. As she walked through the heavy doors, the air seemed to grow colder, more oppressive. The sheriff's deputies didn't look at her, just nodded in acknowledgement as she passed. They had no reason to suspect that a city detective was anything other than a passerby. Harold King's office was at the back of the building, far from the front desks, as though he liked to keep his distance. Caroline couldn't help but notice how much like a fortress the office appeared: polished wooden furniture, an American flag draped across the wall behind his desk, his sheriff's star gleaming under the soft light. It was a room built to command respect, and for a moment, Caroline found herself questioning everything she thought she knew. "Detective Wilson," Sheriff King's voice broke through her reverie, smooth and cordial. "What brings you to my humble office?" Caroline turned to face him, trying to keep her composure. The man exuded an air of calm superiority, his wide frame filling the doorway as he stood. He smiled, a practiced, almost charming smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Those eyes, cold and calculating, held a certain danger. "I'm investigating the missing children," Caroline said, keeping her voice even. "I've been reviewing the cases, and I was hoping you could shed some light on a few details." King's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. It was subtle, but Caroline saw it. She could sense that he was already measuring her up, deciding how to handle her. "I'm afraid I can't help you much with that, Detective. I've got no information on those cases beyond what's already in the reports. You'll find them straightforward, nothing out of the ordinary," he replied smoothly, taking a step into the room, his voice low and deliberate. "Sometimes children get lost in the system. It's tragic, but that's the reality of it. Nothing sinister." But Caroline wasn't convinced. Something in the way he spoke, in the way he avoided her gaze, sent a chill down her spine. She wasn't here to buy his lies, and she wasn't about to back down. "I've been looking through the records, and I'm noticing something strange," she said, not breaking eye contact. "A lot of the children who've gone missing are from black families. That's not a coincidence, is it?" For a moment, King's face froze. His smile didn't disappear entirely, but it became thin, strained. The warmth in his eyes was replaced with something colder, something more calculating. "That's an interesting observation, Detective," he said slowly, "but I assure you, these cases are being handled by the book. We've been doing everything by the rules." But Caroline knew better than to believe him. She had learned to trust her instincts. She had been trained to recognize when someone was hiding the truth, and Sheriff King was definitely hiding something. "I'd like to see the full case files on the children," she said. "I want to understand how they ended up in foster care, who authorized the removals, and why no one has been able to find them." King's gaze sharpened, his lips pressing into a thin line. For a brief moment, Caroline saw the mask slip. The sheriff's calm, collected facade cracked just enough for her to catch a glimpse of the man underneath, a man who was used to having control, who didn't like the idea of losing it. "You'll have to go through the proper channels for that," King said. his voice now cold and clipped. "Those files are confidential. I'm not asking for your permission, Sheriff. I'm asking for your cooperation. I'm conducting a full investigation, and I intend to get answers," Caroline replied, her tone hardening. King gave her one last look, his lips curling slightly into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Be careful, detective. You're treading on dangerous ground. This town values its peace," he said, his voice quiet but loaded with menace. "You won't get far if you start digging into things that aren't meant to be dug up." As Caroline walked out of the office, she felt the weight of his warning settle on her shoulders, but she knew one thing for certain: she had uncovered a trail, and she wasn't going to let it go, no matter how dangerous it became. Caroline didn't waste any time. She had a plan, and the first step was to follow the money, find out who was benefiting from these disappearances, who was turning a blind eye to it, and who was getting paid. Caroline's investigation was now in full swing. She had gathered enough circumstantial evidence to know that Sheriff King was at the center of the operation. The missing children, the forged documents, the trail of broken families, everything pointed back to him. But she needed more. She needed solid proof that would bring him down. Her next move was to find someone who had witnessed the transactions, someone who could testify to the sheriff's role in the disappearances. The problem was, no one in town would dare speak out against King. He had too much power, too much influence. But Caroline knew that someone had seen something, and she wouldn't stop until she found that person. Her breakthrough came when she visited the local diner late one evening. It was a hole-in-the-wall place where the same faces gathered each night, working-class people who had lived in Silver Creek for generations. Caroline sat at the counter, her eyes scanning the room. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she knew when she saw it: a man sitting alone at a booth near the back, his eyes darting nervously as he sipped his coffee. He looked familiar, one of the men from the foster care system who had disappeared years ago, a former social worker who had worked under Sheriff King. His name was James Walker, and his face had aged quickly since his time in the system. He was a man who had seen too much and said too little. Caroline approached him carefully, taking a seat across from him. His eyes widened when he saw her, and he stiffened, clearly frightened. "James Walker?" Caroline asked gently, trying to keep her voice calm and inviting. "I'm Detective Caroline Wilson. I'm investigating the disappearances of several children in Silver Creek. I think you might know something that could help." James hesitated for a long time, his fingers tightening around the cup in front of him. Finally, he looked around the diner as if checking to see who might be listening before he leaned in closer. "I don't want any part of this," he whispered hoarsely. "I was just a kid then. I had to do what they told me, or I'd end up like the others. But I saw it. I saw the deals, the children, taken from their homes, placed in the system, and then, they just disappeared. Sheriff King was behind it all. He was the one who arranged it." Caroline's heart skipped a beat. She had known King was involved, but hearing it from someone who had witnessed it firsthand was a different matter entirely. James continued, his voice trembling as he recounted what he had seen. "I was working with the social services office when they first started bringing in the kids. No paperwork, no files, just names and faces. And then they'd disappear. I saw the sheriff's men come in, take them out, and then I wouldn't hear anything else. It was like they never existed. And the thing is, it wasn't just one or two kids, it was dozens. It was a system. And King was the one who ran it." Caroline could feel the weight of his words. She had known something like this was happening, but hearing it from someone who had been part of the machine made it all the more real. Sheriff King wasn't just a man breaking the law. He was the architect of a criminal operation that spanned years. A man who had used his position to exploit vulnerable children for profit. James lowered his voice even further. "You have to be careful, detective. People like me, we don't get out of these things. King has too many connections. He'll make sure you never make it out of here with your evidence." Caroline nodded. She knew the risks, but she couldn't back down now. She had a duty to the children who had been lost, to the families who had been torn apart, and she couldn't let Sheriff King continue his reign of terror any longer. "I'm going to bring him down," Caroline said quietly but with determination, "and I'm going to make sure this town knows the truth about what happened." James looked at her, a mixture of fear and hope in his eyes. "You're brave, but don't say I didn't warn you." As Caroline left the diner, she felt a surge of adrenaline. She had the truth now, and she had a witness, but she still had one major hurdle to overcome: getting that truth into the right hands. Her first stop was the local foster care system. The agency responsible for placing children was a small, understaffed office, and it wasn't difficult for Caroline to gain access. She met with a social worker named Nancy, an exhausted woman in her late 30s who had seen more than her fair share of broken homes. Nancy was reluctant to speak at first, but Caroline knew how to break down walls. She started by asking about the missing children, the ones who had been removed from their homes but never made it into the system. Nancy hesitated, glancing over her shoulder before speaking. There are cases I can't explain. Kids who were placed with families and then just disappeared. No one talks about it, but the paperwork doesn't add up. I've seen it myself, she whispered, her eyes darting around nervously. They were taken by someone who didn't care about the rules. Caroline's heart sank. This was the confirmation she needed. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. They were taken by Sheriff King, weren't they? Caroline asked, her voice soft but firm. Nancy's face turned pale. I don't know for sure, she replied, but the names on the adoption papers, they never made it to the foster parents. There were never any real placements. They were just gone. Caroline didn't need to hear more. She had what she needed. The sheriff's involvement was now undeniable. He had been using his power to orchestrate a silent, insidious trade in children. And now, the town of Silver Creek would pay the price. As Caroline began to piece together the truth, the town of Silver Creek seemed to fall into an unsettling calm. People went about their daily lives, business as usual, unaware of the storm that was brewing just beneath the surface. The sheriff's office still carried on its work. The mayor continued to smile for the press, and the townsfolk nodded in greeting to the lawmen they trusted. But in the shadows, the tension was palpable. Caroline was closing in, and everyone could feel it, even if they couldn't yet name the threat. With James Walker's testimony, Caroline now had the missing piece of the puzzle, but she knew it wasn't going to be enough to simply expose Sheriff King in Silver Creek. She needed to take it higher. She needed to make sure the FBI would get involved, that the federal authorities would take action. King had too much power in this town, too many loyal followers, and too many people willing to turn a blind eye. Caroline had made her move. She had presented her findings to the FBI, and they had prepared to make their own investigation public. The plan was set in motion, but there was one critical element still missing: the arrest. Caroline spent that entire week on edge, running through the details in her mind over and over again. James Walker's testimony, the hidden documents, the federal agents who had now been brought in, everything was aligned. But Sheriff King was a man who knew how to play the game. He had powerful allies, people who would do anything to protect him. It wasn't just a matter of securing evidence anymore. It was about timing, waiting for the right moment to strike. The FBI agents were ready. They had tapped into King's phone lines, traced his movements, and gathered enough intel to know that the time was now. King had been meeting with unknown figures late at night, probably finalizing his escape plan or trying to cover his tracks. It was clear that he knew something was coming. The operation was set for a Thursday night, when King would be alone at the sheriff's station, finishing paperwork. Caroline had arranged for backup and carefully reviewed the plan with the agents. As they approached the sheriff's office, the town seemed quieter than usual, as if everyone was holding their breath. With a sense of finality, the agents moved in. The office doors were swung open, and Caroline entered with the team. The sheriff was sitting behind his massive oak desk, staring at a stack of paperwork, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. His usual calm, imposing demeanor faltered when he looked up and saw the federal agent standing before him. "What is this?" he asked, his voice unnervingly steady. "What's going on here?" Caroline stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. "Sheriff Harold King," she began, her voice unwavering. "You are under arrest for the kidnapping and trafficking of minors, abuse of power, and conspiracy to commit organized crime. You have the right to remain silent." For a brief moment, there was silence, an eerie, charged silence that stretched between them. Then, Sheriff King stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His eyes were dark, full of fury and disbelief. "You don't know what you're doing," he growled. "You're making a huge mistake." But the agents had already moved in. Before he could do anything, they cuffed him, forcefully restraining his arms. Caroline watched as the man who had held so much power in Silver Creek was now rendered completely helpless. The mask of control shattered. Sheriff King was arrested and taken into custody, his empire collapsing in the wake of his actions. The weight of the truth had finally caught up to him. Caroline made her way to the FBI field office in the nearest city, a 2-hour drive from Silver Creek. She knew she had to present everything she had: James's testimony, the forged documents, the records she'd uncovered, and everything that pointed back to the sheriff. She knew this wasn't just a local case anymore. It was part of a much larger network, and it had to be taken down once and for all. The FBI agents she spoke to were shocked by the extent of the operation, but they didn't hesitate. Caroline's work had given them the foothold they needed to pursue the case at the federal level. They promised to get a team together and begin working on a plan to arrest Sheriff King and dismantle the operation. As Caroline drove back to Silver Creek, she felt a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. The town was about to erupt in chaos, and she couldn't predict what would happen next. But one thing was certain: Sheriff Harold King's reign of terror was coming to an end. It wasn't just Silver Creek that was going to change, it was the entire system that allowed men like King to operate unchecked, and Caroline was determined to make sure that no more children would be lost in the darkness beneath the sheriff's star. The tension in Silver Creek had become unbearable. Caroline could feel it in the air: the whispers in the streets, the glances exchanged between residents, the growing awareness that something was about to break. Sheriff King had been the town's pillar of authority for so long, and now, it seemed as though his empire was crumbling, piece by piece. And yet, despite the mounting evidence, he hadn't been arrested yet, not officially. The trial of Sheriff Harold King was a spectacle that Silver Creek could not ignore. The town, which had once reverently looked up to him as a beacon of law and order, was now forced to face the horrifying reality of the man who had controlled their lives for years. But the trial wasn't just about one man, it was about a system that allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. Caroline stayed in Silver Creek for a while, continuing her work with the FBI to dismantle any remaining parts of the trafficking ring. She knew that, though King was behind bars, there were still many people who had benefited from the system he had built. The road to justice was long, but the victory in King's arrest was a start. As for Caroline, she knew her work in Silver Creek was done. But she also knew that this was only one battle in a much larger war against corruption, inequality, and abuse of power. There were other towns, other systems that needed her, and she was ready to continue the fight. But as she stood on the outskirts of Silver Creek, looking back one last time at the town she had saved, she couldn't help but think of the children, the ones who had never been found, whose names were lost in the system. Their stories still haunted her, reminding her that the fight for justice was far from over. For Silver Creek, the darkness under the sheriff's star had finally been exposed, but the scars remained, deep and unhealed. The battle might have been won, but the war was still raging. Caroline attended every day of the trial. The courtroom was filled with tension. Residents of Silver Creek, many of whom had once been loyal to King, now sat on opposite sides. Some were there to see justice served, others were there to support the man they once trusted, but everyone knew that something would change in their town forever. The evidence was irrefutable. James Walker's testimony was crucial, but the documentation from the foster care system, the phone records, and the hidden accounts exposed just how deep King's corruption went. He had manipulated the system, forging documents, and using his position to funnel children out of the state, into a network that operated under the radar, making untold profits from their disappearance. For the first time, people in the courtroom saw the full extent of his actions. The families whose children had been lost spoke out, mothers who had their kids taken from them, fathers who had no idea where their children had gone, and those who had searched for years with no answers. Their voices echoed in the courtroom, their pain and anger tangible, raw, and unrelenting. King's defense was weak. He tried to claim that he was simply doing his job, but the lies were thin, transparent. The jury didn't need to hear any more. The evidence spoke louder than he could. When the verdict was read, there was no surprise. Harold King was found guilty on all charges. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, his name forever stained by his crimes. As Caroline watched him taken away in handcuffs, she felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. The justice had been served, but at what cost? Silver Creek would never be the same. In the weeks that followed, Silver Creek slowly began to heal. The town was shaken, but there was hope now, hope that the truth had finally come to light, that the families whose children had been stolen could begin to rebuild their lives. But there was also a deep sense of grief, a recognition that the very systems they had trusted had been corrupted beyond measure. Months passed, and the dust began to settle in Silver Creek. The headlines shifted to new scandals, new stories, but for those who had lived through the nightmare, the events of the past year were never forgotten. The town streets were quieter now. The whispers that once followed Sheriff King's every move had faded, replaced with discussions of recovery and rebuilding. The courthouse, once a place of quiet justice, now stood as a symbol of the truth that had been brought to light. And though some still clung to their loyalty to the sheriff, the majority of the town had come to terms with the truth: no one could protect corruption forever. Caroline had left Silver Creek by then, but she had left a mark that wouldn't soon be erased. The FBI had continued its investigation, making arrests and breaking up the network that King had helped run for so many years. Some of the children who had disappeared had been found, their stories of survival nothing short of miraculous. They had been returned to their families, their futures uncertain but brighter than ever before. But for those who remained lost in the system, the journey was far from over. The work that Caroline and the FBI had started was only a fraction of the larger problem. As she traveled to new towns and worked on new cases, she carried the memory of Silver Creek with her, the families who had fought for justice and those who had lost too much. It wasn't enough to simply punish the guilty, it was about ensuring that the system itself, the one that had allowed the sheriff's reign to continue for so long, was overhauled. Change had to come from the ground up, and Caroline knew she wouldn't rest until she saw it. The streets of Silver Creek had been cleansed of one darkness, but the fight against the shadows that still lingered was far from over. And so, as Caroline stood outside a new courthouse in a new town, staring into the horizon, she whispered to herself, "This isn't the end, this is just the beginning." With those words, she stepped forward, ready for whatever came next, ready to bring justice where it was needed most. And as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, there was a glimmer of hope that, no matter how deep the darkness, there would always be someone to shine a light. The fight for the stolen children had only just begun.